Welcome everybody to the first official Saved Against Fear panel of 2020. And we're here live with you on Zoom from lots of different places around the country and different countries even. And let's start with introductions. So if I could get Calvin to give us a start on that, go ahead, introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you. I'm Calvin Johns. I design games out of Anthropos Games. We are located here in Austin, Texas. It's beautifully an hour earlier here, so 4:30. Some of the games I think that recommended me for this panel would be Early Dark, one of our low fantasy games that came out 10 years ago, so it's a little bit of an old one, and newer games, Fantagy and King Pink. I have a PhD in anthropology. I studied microcultures, like emergent forms of gaming and things like that. Tangentially related, but I definitely use that research like inspiring my designs and things.
That's awesome. Great. Mike, what about you?
Hi, I'm Mike Espinoza. I'm in Mexico. I'm a Mexican game designer and layout artist. I currently working with my PI as the director of visual design and making like all the layout and stuff. And I've been working for a while now on my first game, role-playing game called Nahual, which is a Mexican cultural role-playing game. And I'm also like starting to a company to translate into Spanish, licensing RPGs into Spanish to publish them over here in Mexico because other people only play D&D and World Darkness. So I want to introduce Mexican people to other indie games and more variety.
Excellent. Thank you for being here. Alan, please tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Alan Turner. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
I'm Alan Turner, and I'm an Afro-Indigenous game designer. Done tabletop games, video games, and most recently, Edgegore, the role-playing game, which is an indigenously themed kind of horror RPG. I teach game design out of DePaul University and do all kinds of stuff where I'm kind of focusing how do we use games in play as a way to get people to engage their personal narratives and take those narratives back out into the world and own them and work with them and build relationships with them.
Excellent. And Banana, can you please tell us about yourself?
Hello, yes, I am Banana and I'm the owner and co-founder of a small box board game and RPG publishing company called Game in a Curry. I am also a designer and writer, and I make board games and card games and RPGs. Some of my work includes John Schubel in the Banquet Hall that I was working on with Sen, so we worked together on that. I also worked on Scooby-Doo Betrayal at Mystery Mansion and Terror Below.
Excellent. And my name is Sen Fong Lim. I'm a therapist and psychology professor here in London, Ontario, Canada. I'm also a game designer, and I think that relevant titles for this particular panel for me would be Jiangshi Blood in the Banquet Hall, which is about the immigrant experience from a Chinese perspective during the 1920s. All right, cool. So we know who we all are, and we have some people joining us for the chat as guests. And let's start talking about the questions about representation. So what do you think designers need to know about representing culture in games? And I'm going to point this at, I'll start with Mike. Mike, what do you think designers need to know when they're trying to represent a culture in a game?
You mean a culture that's not theirs?
It could be either.
Okay, I think like one of the main challenges is to be respectful to it, like to don't fall into cliches or just like think because you saw a movie, you know the culture. Like there is a lot of nuances and a lot of deep things that can pass if you don't have like enough information or experience with the culture. So I guess that's like the starting point, like to have a deep knowledge, a well knowledge of it. And in the case if it's about not your culture, like I guess the question would be also like, why do you want to do that? Like, why do you want to make a game about these other cultures that are not yours? And ask you that question at least like as honestly as you can. That's what I think. You're muted.
Sen, you're muted.
Oh, Calvin, what do you think about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think those. I mean, I think those are great. What Mike said, and I think, I mean, it is different if you're writing about your culture or someone else's. And then even more broadly, I think, you know, we talked about some of the questions maybe, and how we could start thinking about this in the last week. And that idea of, yeah, even if you're writing about your own culture, what do you have to keep in mind, right? And I think that is really important about, you know, how do you represent a culture in a game? I mean, like, what are you representing? Are you representing their architecture and the art? Are you representing their religion? And when you make a pantheon or something, I mean, are you pulling things, you know, from where you're pulling them, and how you're going to do that representation, right? And there's definitely, I think, yeah, respectful and completely irresponsible and even harmful ways to do that, for sure. But if you're writing about your own culture, what does it mean to represent a culture in games? I think is, I guess, a really big question. I'm sure we probably all have, you know, different ways that we've done that or different ways to think about that. So yeah, I guess just basic big, it would be, how do you want to represent, or what are you representing? Is it tone? Is it art? Is it, you know, even if it's your own culture, what is it that you're trying to represent, is one of those big questions, along with what Mike said about why, I think.
So the what and the why. Banana, maybe you can talk to like the how. What is it? How do we represent cultures, our own cultures, other cultures in a game in a way that is not appropriative, that is, you know, culturally sensitive? What do you think?
So I think just touching on what Mike said earlier, which was intention. I think that intention is critical to like any sort of design, right? So thinking about like why you want to do something and then starting from there, and like asking yourself questions like, if I'm going to be, you know, doing this thing, why do I want to do this thing, first of all, like you were saying, and also, you know, how am I going to do it? And if I'm going to go through with it, then who should I be talking to, and what should I be researching, and what should I like know? So taking, for example, like Jiangshi, when we were working on Jiangshi Blood in the Banquet Hall, you know, both of us are Chinese American / Canadian, but you know, there's still so much that we don't know, because the time frame that we're choosing to play this game in, to set this game in, is the 1920s. First of all, we're neither of us from the 1920s. Second of all, neither of us come from restaurant families. So that's another gap in our knowledge. We have several friends and, you know, maybe family members that have run restaurants or come from restaurant families, but us ourselves, like, we don't know a lot about it, but we have, you know, we have this interest in this setting because it's such a large part of our culture itself. So I think trying to invite as many voices into a project is really important. So like, you know, asking people, interviewing people, like, you know, asking them to collaborate with you, or like asking them to consult, starting from like the ground up is always great.
What? Sorry, I keep on hitting the space bar. Spacebar being hitting. Alan, from your perspective, what do you think designers need to know about representing culture? You're also muted. You fell into the Sen trap.
Yeah. I was trying to, I think I held on the space bar too long.
Yeah, that's what I was doing.
Yeah. So I guess I would second basically everything everyone else has said up until this point, but particularly what Banana was saying about talking to people. I think, and also that question of first asking yourself, what is it and why is it you're doing this, and making sure that that is present in the conversations that you're having with people who are owners of the culture. Because if you're writing from something that's not your own culture, then there needs to be an effort to respect the sovereignty of the people who are the owners of that culture and the keepers of that culture. Understanding what might seem like it should be accessible to you because you saw it in a book, but might be completely taboo to someone else. So the thing that Mike commented on, which is nuance, I think nuance is huge and important, and that even applies to your own culture. Because just because you belong to a culture doesn't mean you're knowledgeable about the culture. And it doesn't mean you have permission to share particular narratives or stories, or visuals or graphics. So like, just because you might be, for instance, Hawaiian, and maybe you've got some traditional tattoos, but you got those in a tattoo shop and not from a traditional tattooer. You don't actually, maybe you might be disconnected because of colonization issues in your community from your culture, and someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, can I use that in my game?" And you want to say, "Yeah," but in reality, maybe you can't. Maybe you don't have permission to give access to that piece of art because that art is sacred, or it means a particular thing at a particular time. So reaching out, setting up protocols for communication, being respectful to no's. Consent is important in everything, right? So if you walk up to someone who is a representative or a knower or a knowledge keeper, a wisdom keeper of the culture, and they say no, don't shop around to somebody else until they say yes. Respect that no, and then see if you can come up with an alternative that allows you to do kind of what you're trying to do, and but meet their needs. And then always be willing to ask yourself, if I got a no, maybe I need to change what it is I intended to do. And also pay attention to whether or not you're inviting other people in who are from the culture to actually do the writing. So they're actually doing the creation, and they're putting their lens out there.
That's a really good point. And I know that for Banana and myself, when we were working on Juncture, we took out very specific Taoist things, because that is, people are Taoist, and we didn't want to step all over that. We had still like the ideas, but not the specifics, right? So we wanted to give people the idea that there is, Taoism is a thing, but if you want to know more about it, because neither Banana and I are Taoist, go learn about it. This is not a resource book for that, right? And you brought up a really good point that, there needs to be permission granted, or at least asked for, I think, in a lot of these stories that are being told about cultures that are not our own, especially. But even within our own cultures, we still have to look for that kind of approval, maybe from the community at large. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about permissions, taboos, things like that. I'm going to start with Calvin. Calvin, what are some areas of taboo that you've seen in games that or that you've used, that you've got permission for? You wonder if people have got permission for, if you understand my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I'm trying to think of like a really great example, but I mean, the obvious ones come with like religions and magic systems, right? A lot of our games, people will just pull from a religious text and sort of turn that into a spell or something, right? And so to me, I think that's kind of like a really sort of quick, big, obvious one. I don't know if that's exactly on the idea of something that's literally taboo in that culture so much as that idea of accessibility and ownership, like what Alan was talking about. But I mean, and we've had some conversations about that, I think too, like particularly like with like Wicca or, witches and things, maybe more in the last couple of years. But before that, I mean, just grabbing something from a religious text that has nothing to do with like magic and turning it into magic in this kind of very, I don't want to say hokey. I mean, it's done a lot of harm, right? But in a very sort of westernized sense, right? Like what is science versus what is magic? To take anything from another culture and call it magic is kind of just the same as taking something from a culture and like calling it art, right? Like, ooh, this was a dish that was used to eat with. Now it's art, right? That kind of idea of like those Western categories that get imposed on things. And so I guess I don't have too much maybe specific things with trying to play with the taboo on purpose, or asking for permission to maybe use those. But I do think in that area of domain, I still think ties in, right? Like taking religion, making it magic, taking those sacred texts or things like you said visually, right? Like with tattoos, and making it into something sort of sensational. I mean, that's exoticizing in a way, right? And there's probably great ways to do it in communication with people, right? Like, I mean, there is ideas of magic in other cultures and things. So how can you do that respectfully and make it maybe even something innovative that helps another audience kind of understand that better? But just sort of like grabbing and saying like, ooh, isn't this mysterious? I think is maybe where some of those difficulties lie, that a lot of designers probably grapple with without even knowing it, right? That idea of setting up your reality and building your world.
Yeah, that sense of exoticism and fetishism and all that kind of stuff that goes around with other cultures and other people is kind of troublesome, right? It's problematic. Banana, was there anything in any of the games that you've worked on where you felt like we need to go further and ask for permission to do this type of thing from other members of the culture?
I can touch briefly on other IPs and working on IPs that sometimes have had problematic content in them, and trying to work around it. So I'm gonna try my best to not name the IPs, but there are certain IPs that have had a history of portraying people, and maybe they're older content, or maybe it's like content from a couple of decades ago or something like that, where they have portrayed people in not in more of like a not the best light, more of like a that fetishizing lens. And trying to work around that has been kind of difficult. Unfortunately, now when you're trying to make it a better product or make it like a better thing, you do have to omit a lot of stuff, and you do have to think about oh, back then, when they did this thing, it was definitely not okay. Now, how do we make it a better thing? How do we, try and change the narrative a little bit? So it's I guess that's like one of the things I wanted to touch on. That definitely did not answer the question. But
no, that's okay. We could definitely
yeah.
talk about that.
Yeah.
It's like you're saying the old, oh, it's a product of its time argument or defense, right?
Mhm.
And there has definitely been a lot of backlash, particularly this year, over things like Oriental Adventures and whatnot. Not to name a product, but I'm naming the product. Because it's just done in a way that is not at all sensitive to people who are of the Asian persuasion, and the person right below me. Alan, you brought up the topic, so I'd love to hear from you. What are some areas of taboo and permissions that you've seen where it's been transgressed or that have been done really well?
Hmm. Well, I guess I would start with something that happens all the time within native circles. There is a particular monster that shows up in a lot of books about native that include some kind of native-esque culture. It's like the go-to monster, and it starts with a W, ends with a Digo, and this is a hugely taboo character concept, well, and particularly within Anishinaabe culture, right? Um, and typically only talked about in the winter, if talked about it at all. And then there are things you're supposed to do before you actually even engage conversations about this entity. So it's like it's a big bad thing, and but most folks making role-playing games just decide that is the monster du jour. It's the closest thing that we can think of to a vampire. So we're gonna kind of tell our put out our colonizer fantasy, and we're gonna put this monster in there and kind of rewrap it to be this other thing. But we're gonna keep using this word, which is a big taboo word. And recently there are like native writers who've had who've shown some pushback against it, and it's always a tussle when they're saying, yeah, I don't want to use that word, I can't use that word, I'm not allowed to use that word, I don't have permission to use that word. And um the publishing companies are like, yeah, but we've used this word in the past, so we're going to keep using this word. um so there's that. I think in places where it's been done well, that's a good question. that's a little harder. If I am if I broaden my scope a little bit and include some video games, there's a game that I worked on called When Rivers Were Trails, and When Rivers Were Trails was it's kind of like a, what's that there's this old game where you're playing people who are
Oregon Trail.
Oregon Trail, thank you.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like an Oregon Trail thing, but it's from the point of view of an Anishinaabe person who has been kicked out because of the Dawes Acts, and various things that are happening in the reservation spaces, and there's like reallocation, and they're just trying to survive and make their way west, where there are other different gatherings of Native folks. And to tell that story, to kind of make that thing real, the lead designer reached out to a bunch of us who were from different Native cultures and said, "Can you write these pieces for us?" And we were consulted on the overall narrative, and we were consulted on the micro narratives, and we all worked together to make this wonderful product. And we actively danced around all these things that would normally be put in there because they're easily accessible to non-native peoples. And but when it was all said and done, it was good to kind of look at this thing where we actively didn't anthropomorphize animals. We didn't put very much about the religion in there, but there were things that were mystical and fanciful, and it was historically relevant without necessarily being historically accurate. So there was all this stuff that functioned, and it all spoke from a lens that came from within that culture. And it's a game that would never have been made by people who are on the outside, at least not in that fashion. They wouldn't be able to tell those stories.
Right. Okay, interesting. And I like how you said, historically relevant, not necessarily historically accurate, which is a very important point, I think, when we're talking about culture, because so many designers lean on historicity as their hand waving. Well, it's historically accurate, so we're going to do this. But it's also from a very colonizing point of view in terms of the history that is told in especially American schools and Canadian schools, right? So, yeah, go ahead.
I just want to add that I think it's really important that people recognize that in most cases, when you're getting access to information through a book, the majority of those things are kind of gatekeeping spaces, and those books have been written by colonizers who have taken those stories, and treated them basically like Pokemon, right? They just kind of collected as many as they possibly could, stuck them in a bag, shaved off the edges, and made them fit their own narratives, and then represented them. And so that's what you're getting, and you're not actually getting something that's coming from other people, right?
Right. That's a very good point.
You're not getting it from the people who actually own it.
Right. So straight from the source.
Straight
right?
from the.
Mike, do you have any stories to tell about how permissions have been asked for or granted or denied around things about culture and how they're represented in games?
I mean, I guess, for example, my game I'm working on Nawal, like it's based on an IP, so but the IP, what it does is like tries to represent, and it's from a Mexican comic book artist, and try to represent like those conflicts that were created here in Mexico when the conquistadors came. So we as Mexicans are like the result of that syncretism, right? Like from the Spaniards and the Catholic religion and the native people and their beliefs. It is like, it is intertwined. Like it's different. It's impossible like to separate them. And the comic book is kind of like that too. So when I was writing it, the game is in the present day. So one of the points where I was able to say, okay, this is very important, and I think it's a breaking point where I can say, okay, these characters people will be playing are like me, like are present day Mexicans that really, even if they have that heritage, we don't have that full knowledge. So in the game, my characters have the power to use the Nahual, but they don't know how to use it, because when the conquistadors came, they cut off that connection, that tradition. So the shamans of the old times knew how to perfectly control and use the Nahual powers, but in present day, the characters that you will play in the game is present day Mexicans that suddenly they have this power and they don't know how it works or what to do with it, because they are Mexicans now. They have been robbed from that past. So and they grew up also like Catholics and all that. So for me, what's the point when I say, okay, I am not, maybe it's what I say to myself to like to give me permission of saying, okay, I'm using the know-how and these concepts, which I really don't know, like, so or don't practice, maybe that's the word I could use. But the characters are in a situation similar to what I am, right? It is about something that you don't know, something you were robbed from. So you have this thing, and you have to try to struggle and figure out what to do with it.
Okay, cool. So where should we seek permission? We talk about primary sources. Where would you go to seek permission? And what's the difference about, a primary source versus, say, in some cases where it's a diaspora, where there's like a country, and then there's people from that country who move to another place, and they have different sort of, they actually have different experiences. So who do we seek from, and what actually makes the permission permissible? What are you going to say, Cal?
Yeah, thank you. I think this sort of came up when I was thinking about the last question too, but I think it relates here. Like in our game Early Dark, we tried, it was very much like anti-essentialist, anti-capitalist, anti-Eurocentric, right? Like really trying to pull in different sources and show like a non-Tolkien type world or something. And one of the cultures that took some inspiration from South Asian classical narratives. And, I was learning Sanskrit at the time, and we were translating pieces of the Gita, which, is a very particular text, not, sacred and not sacred in certain ways, but definitely a very pivotal, very important text. And I was talking with a lot of South Asian folks that I knew, and we were talking about what could be in the game, what could be cool, like how we could talk about these things in ways that would cut very much against a lot of things that had come out of obviously British colonizing history in that part of the world, right? And like things that even in ways that certain religious ideas were understood had been, just like Alan said, so westernized, right? Like so westernized, and what that long history and cultural exchange, has led to. It's like, well, talking with a lot of my friends from that area, born and raised, we had some great ideas. And I think, they were fantastic. We I think did some really creative stuff together and some really, worthwhile things in that game. But those were a certain kind of people that were grad students in the United States that represent a certain part of that community that definitely is not the same thing as, people of different backgrounds and stuff in South Asia, right? And so I think that could be one of those things that kind of speaks to Alan's point, and maybe both of those questions, right? Like, was that the best source to talk about these kinds of things to a heavily sort of academic grad student colleague of mine that was detached from certain texts in certain ways, definitely still invested in some ways, but there were other sources I could have gone to, I think even broader. Thankfully, when I did talk to different folks, that there wasn't any sort of harm done there. But yeah, I think like Alan mentioned, right, it's like where those sources you go to, and making sure, like, is it the right one? Does that person really, have that relationship they could share about those things, I think really is key. So yeah, just kind of those two things came together, right? About that idea of maybe taboo, and then also just how do you engage in those conversations? How do you start up those protocols of communication, as Alan said?
Mm-hmm. Alan, how do you do it when you are looking for sources outside of your own area of expertise and cultural experience? Who do you go to?
Oh, that's a good question. As well, I have a small coterie of friends from a wide range of spaces who are all either professors or culture keepers. So they tend to be the people that I reach out to at the very least, to get an idea of who I should talk to. And again, speaking more in the indigenous spaces, there is a when you're looking for first voice references, it's tough. because we got so many different narratives going on at the same time, even within a given nation, that it's hard to find someone who's officially the person who knows that, right? I don't think those really exist, even when it comes to religion, because our everybody has this kind of individualized spirituality that flows with a lot of overlap, and there's a lot of stuff to share, but everybody kind of has their own version of it. But what we do recognize, and what you learn to look for, is kinship and lineage, right? There are people that people within the community respect as elders, one way or another. And I think this is kind of true for just about any cultural group. There are people that folks say, I mean, they may not be a professor, but that grandma over there, she's a great storyteller, and she was an auntie to a bunch of us for a long time, and she knows things. And so sitting and talking with her and getting her perspective, and then getting permission from her to take what she shared with you, or work with her preferably to take what she has to share and find a way to metamorphose that into something that can be accessible to other people. But it's you've got to kind of test it the entire time along the way. You once you get the information, put down what you think you heard, to go back to them and say, hey, is this okay? To give them a chance to say, well, this is awesome, but you got to take that thing out, because we don't talk to people about that. These are not people we don't trust, and then you make adjustments. And as another friend of mine who works over Imaginative, Megan Byrne, pointed out, when you do this, you don't do it and be an asshole, right? It's not, you don't go, okay, or fight them on like the change. You just accept it and move on, right? Because it's your attempt to share their stuff. I think it changes maybe a little bit when you start going into really fanciful areas where you're trying to find inspiration and then write something new. But even then, you have to, I feel like it's necessary to reach back and say, hey, this is a wholly new thing. I'm taking inspiration from here, and is it okay to kind of extrapolate from this idea, or does that feel weird, or does that feel taboo, or does it cause harm, right? And so I think the next part of that is reciprocity. Like, what are you doing to give back, or are you just mining them for information so you can make a buck?
Right, that's a really, really good point. Mike, I wanted to get back to you in terms of the writers of the comic that you're making the game for. They are Mexican, and how does it differ working with a writer who is of the culture, and a game maker who is of the culture? Is it different than perhaps if somebody wasn't of the culture? Is it easier, or is it harder? What do you think?
I mean, I guess, like, when we start talking, you mentioned like the what and the why, and the who also came to my mind, like who is the audience?
Right.
So for me in particular, like I'm writing this game, like, here in Mexico, the indie RPG industry is like non-existent. So if I was to make the game and in Spanish and sell it here in Mexico, I wouldn't have been able to because of many reasons, like economic reasons also. Like a book for most of people of a hobby will be too expensive, and there is a lot of it should be another panel only in that particular thing. But so when I say, okay, well, I want to do this, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm gonna make it both in Spanish and in English, and I've been working, and I'm gonna publish it in both languages. And when I started like play testing with people from the US and from Canada, I started to see, like, because at the beginning, one particular example, I was including so much Spanish, and because for me, like, I mean, I understand perfectly the words and say, like, yeah, it's just a word, like they could learn it or use it or whatever. And then when I started playtesting with English speaking people, I started to see how that was like a barrier, because for them it was very hard to pronounce some words, for example, and so I drop off many of the Spanish words that I was, because it was like so too much. So I still keep some Spanish in it, but I've been like taking some of it down. So that is when I realized, like, okay, yeah, I need to think of the game as a thing that can be played by either nationality, like even Mexicans and Americans and Canadians and Europeans and people from all over the place, if they get interest into it. Because also, like, the main reason I was doing the game is because I want also my culture to be represented in the space. So if I put barriers just because I want to use a fancy Spanish word, like, that's gonna be the whole purpose, right? So yeah, like, I guess related to theme and to the things we were like doing, and also like the good thing is that the IP holder, like the comic book artist, was like very like open, saying you change whatever you need to change to make it a game, like to make it work as a game. So that also gave me a lot of liberty to be able to mold it, because when you are just writing a story, you don't care about if the party will be together or if this will work as a group activity or whatever, right? So that gave me, in that respect, that was super easy. And in the themes and cultures I'm representing, I mean, I grew as a Catholic. There's heavy Catholic themes in it. So I guess culturally and thematically, it was, I haven't thought about it actually, to be honest, like how hard it will have been for somebody not of my culture, like to participate or write for it. The thing that for me was the opposite, right? Like the player, like when I'm designing, I have to give the player the tools and to make them like click with the game.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's also some during playtesting, some people also like ask, like, how do I play a Mexican? And I was like, the same way you play an elf or like you're a human being, like we are human beings. Just play the character, and also like don't coy away is the word, like don't refrain yourself from playing the game just because you are afraid
Right.
you will be playing misrepresenting a Mexican. I'd rather have you make mistakes but playing my game. And that's like, for me, that was like the big thing, me being here in Mexico, right?
Mm-hmm. And that's great. We'll talk about that for sure, because that is definitely a question on the list. But before we get there, Banana, I wanted to ask you specifically, because I know the process that we went through. So Mike has already talked about working with writers who are of the culture. We decided to kind of skew it a little bit weirdly, and we have writers that aren't of the culture using our game system to write about their own culture. How did that work, and why did we do that? Why did we decide to do that?
I think that, first of all, I think that from playtesting the game and playing the game with other people, we realized that the system itself sort of lends to the immigrant experience as a whole. So it was something that, it wasn't just like the Chinese diaspora that, that experience, like, this thing that we were playing, but it was also relevant for, like, other immigrant cultures or other people from immigrant families. So when we were playing, I think some people were like, oh, I feel seen, even though, this isn't my culture, or like, this relates to me and my family. And I can, like, see this happening with my family. So that's one of the reasons why we included other cultures and invite them on to write for the game itself, using their own, family backgrounds and things like that. I also kind of wanted to talk about how, like, how from like a Chinese perspective, like how it's very different talking to other Chinese people from China versus like people who are Chinese American or Chinese Canadian.
And anywhere in between.
Because, like, yeah,
right?
like, yeah. And the information that you get, like, if you showed a thing to, someone from Hong Kong or Taiwan like this thing, they'd be like, oh, this looks great, like I don't see a problem with it. But if you showed it to like a person who's living in, you know, the States or Canada, who's, you know, a Chinese immigrant or comes from like a Chinese immigrant family, then like they would have this, they would see something, they would catch something that like, you know, usually like another person probably, you know, from China would probably not be able to see. So I think that like there are all these like nuances like we've been talking about that we sort of have to pay attention to, and inviting like, you know, sensitivity readers or consultants, or just having lots of pairs of eyes just like check over things is really important.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll speak a little bit more to that because it's, you know, our project, it was intimate to what we were doing. And just some weird examples. So my family is from southern China, and they escaped from China during the Second World War, and went up through Malaysia. So my family, my culture is as much Chinese as it is Malaysian in a lot of ways. Like, I wear a sarong a lot. You know, that doesn't make me Malaysian, but it's definitely part of my culture. And Banana's family is mostly from like Guangdong and Hong Kong, and then we have friends who are from Taiwan and all over, and then mainland. But we got this interesting email from people who were from Britain, Chinese people who were from Britain, and in America and Canada, we've had like literally over 140 odd years, 150 odd years of Chinese immigration to Canada and the United States. It happened right around, you know, the gold rush times, 1850s, 1860s. And so we've had a lot of time with Chinese people here. And while there were Chinese people earlier in Great Britain, like in the late 1700s, there wasn't a mass influx until the 1980s, right? And you think about that, and you think about that time scale, like 100 years different. We in Canada and the United States have actually gone through like 100 years more of assimilation. And it's, you know, it's not great by any means, but it's there, that we've had more time. Whereas a lot of people, the biggest pushback we got was from people in Britain saying, you know, are you like opening the door to like casual racism at the game table by making a game about Chinese restaurants? Because they have been for the last, you know, 40 years subjected to these, you know, tropes of, you know, all Chinese people run a takeaway. That's what they call Chinese restaurants in Britain, right? So that was really interesting to us because it's like, well, no, this is entirely what we would write about here in Canada and the United States, without recognizing that the experience of Chinese people in other countries is kind of different, right? And it's different in Malaysia, it's different in Singapore, it's different all over the world. And that's something that we were very specific in our game. It's like, no, this is the Chinese American, Chinese Canadian experience. And we have to be that specific about it because it doesn't really necessarily reflect strongly specifics. Generalities, sure, but not specifics. And we have to be very careful about that. Next question I wanted to ask you goes back to what Mike was saying. Oh, Alan has a question or a comment. Go ahead, Alan.
I just want to add a comment to that, that it's really important to recognize that proximity to trauma is going to really affect the answers that we get from people when we start seeking permission. And, you know, talking to someone who is closer to any kind of survival trauma or oppression trauma, and people from the same culture who are further removed from it, they're going to have a completely different story and completely different expectations. So the things that you're describing across Chinese culture, we have those same experiences within Native spaces and within Black spaces, and it's also a function of how long people have been there, who's got survival equity, how long they have been surviving a particular way. And so some things that are problematic actually kind of get become acceptable, and they say yeah go ahead and do that, where people who are like closer to the trauma are like, hell no, you can't do that.
Right.
So yeah, so that's something to be mindful of when we're seeking out permission, who we're talking to and how close they are to any particular types of trauma that we may be trying to represent in the narrative that we're creating.
That's a great point. I once read somewhere that the more we try to do empathy work, and we'll talk about this, I guess, in the empathy panel as well, the more we try to do empathy work in games, the more we're actually potentially putting people who went through the trauma at risk of reliving it, right? For the sake of trying to teach other people about that thing. So it is this kind of gray area, this fine line that we're walking. Let's talk about players, because Mike talked about the players who want to play as a different culture but don't know how. What are some tips, tricks, tools, et cetera, that we might afford our own players so that they feel safe in doing it? They feel like, oh, I can do this, and there could be a person of that culture at the table with me, and I'm not going to completely insult them. Right? What are some tools? I'll actually start with Mike because you brought it up. What are some things that you're writing into the game for Nawal that help players play in a sensitive manner?
I mean, I talk about it in the book, like as the same way I mentioned just a while back. I'm really like, I don't know, permissive about it. Like I basically tell players like, it's okay if you play a Mexican. Like I want you to play a Mexican. Like I want you to experience this other world or these other things that are happening. And I guess like my game being a PBTA game, like the moves and the mechanics or the stuff that players will be doing or encountering or interacting with, like are very much about like Mexican things, or the way we live, or the way we kind of think. In I don't know how to put this, like basically because it is what I haven't seen in other games, like me doing it as a Mexican and saying, okay, this is what this move would tell you to, this is what this particular action or encounter will be like, because that's how things are in Mexico. And for me, it's kind of quote unquote easy because the whole game is in Mexico, and we like the there is other like cultures and races here, but it is very minor. Like it's not as the US that you have a big plethora of cultures and people. So I guess like for me being so like contained into like, you are in Mexico, you're in a Mexican modern city, and you're playing Mexicans, and the type of rules and moves and situations I give in the book are like very Mexican. So for me, it was kind of like, how to say, quote unquote, easy in that way.
Okay, Banana. I know that we wrote a whole bunch of stuff and we got help from a lot of people to do it. Can you tell us some of the things that we were talking about when we were deciding how do people play as Chinese immigrants without, this traditional tropes of like accents and things like that? What did we write?
Yeah, so I think that along with, all the other safety tools like the open door policy and, making sure that players understand that this is not going to be a game for everyone. This is going to be a game for some people if they want to, play it, if they're interested in reading it. Like, some of the content is not going to be for everyone. Along with all of that, we also had a section that we wrote with James Mendez Hodes, who's a sensitivity consultant and cultural consultant, who basically put together the section that we put together the section on like how to play as a Chinese character without, getting into stereotypes. So basically what it boils down to is focus on what your character's wants, hopes, and dreams are. Like, don't like try to go into things that you don't know anything about, or like try too hard into, trying to make them into, like the example that we gave was becoming like this martial arts obsessed weirdo, because like you're running a restaurant, you're not going to have time to, first of all, you're not going to have time to, focus on martial arts or like, pick that up as a hobby. You probably know a little bit, but it's just a hobby, it's not like anything that's too that's going to take up too much of your time. And then second of all, like, making sure that the players are grounded in in these different things on their character sheets as hobbies, interests, hopes and dreams, wants. Like, these are things that make up the character. These are not like, these are sort of like, they make them more human, if anything, because like a lot of the time when we see games that feature Asian characters, they're exoticized, or they're like, made to be like very mystical and mysterious, when real people aren't like that. So that's like one of the things that we put out there. Another thing was how to, because our game does deal with racism and with antagonistic NPCs. Mendez did this great job of working together with us in trying to create this section where we talk about how to portray racism, but like not do it in a way that might hurt someone at the table. So what that means is avoiding, slurs, avoiding like, going into detail that would hurt someone, like maybe veiling it over instead of, just going straight into it. So there's that. And also just trying to make sure that everyone feels comfortable at the table. So making sure the lines and veils are, available to everyone, making sure that the X card is available to everyone, making sure that everyone can feel comfortable with stopping and leaving and taking a bio break, or just like, making sure everyone's needs are met at the table before, going further. I think sometimes when we're like in the middle of playing a game, we just don't realize that it's just a game. Like, we're not hurting anyone by just leaving or just by like stopping the game. Like, you are more important than the game. And that's something that we sort of emphasized while writing this thing.
Yeah, great, good stuff. And it was really eye-opening working with Mendez in terms of thinking about, we'd actually have to teach people how to portray racism in a safe way. It was a weird thing to get your head around, but it's really, really an important part of of that idea of not letting it happen at the table, but recognizing it as something that does happen, right? Without having it actually happen. It was interesting stuff. Alan, what about you? What are some things that you would say to players in terms of respectful portrayal? What are some do's and don'ts?
So I mean, basically everything that Banana just said. There's one of the things I have told people, especially when I've done talks about Edgegore, is that there's two things going on there for me in the game. One is I've made like all these tribal templates, but they're on a certain level, they're meant to be disposable. So if you are from a culture, play your culture. Take one of the things that's there, toss it to the side, replace it with your own, and fashion that version of your culture into that space, and then just play that and play what you know, like, right, play close to home. And then there's a thought that if you are trying to play something outside of your realm of knowledge, stay away from the tropes and stereotypes and focus in, like Banana was saying, on the humanity of the person, right? Like, and I think accents is a great example of that, right? An accent is an outsider perception. People in the language aren't speaking in an accent. They don't perceive themselves as speaking in an accent. They just perceive themselves as speaking. So if you were to turn if you were switched from being a voyeur to being someone who's on the inside, then just play a person speaking perfect English and call it a day, because that's what they're doing, right? They're in reality, within the context of their language, they're speaking their language and they're doing it as a person within that space. So there would be no accent to worry about. But yeah, so avoid the stereotypes. When it comes to racism, don't be Quentin Tarantino, right? You don't need to put everything on screen in the most gruesomely pornographic way you possibly can. It's perfectly fine to put stuff off camera, right? So having lines and veils and X cards and all that stuff on the table as well. Being willing to stop, paying attention to people's body languages. Sometimes people aren't aren't always able to vocalize their needs, but you can see it if you're paying attention. I think all those things apply. And I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to asking yourself, what are the needs of the person I'm playing? What are the needs of the group of people around them? What are the needs of the cultural space that I'm occupying? And playing towards that, and I think you'll be okay.
Mm-hmm. Calvin, what about you? What are some thoughts on how players can respectfully represent a character from another culture than their own?
Yeah, yeah. I guess when I first heard your question, I was thinking of, like, for example, in our game Early Dark, it's not so much like actual world cultures, right? They're fantasy cultures, and two of, like, sort of the main civilizations have three genders. And it was just, you know, a great theoretical conceit. Like, we're making a fantasy game. There are tons of different ways to have gender. They don't need to be binary, right? And I remember, like, on, like, you know, Reddit this was 2010, 2011, right? And on Reddit forums, you know, people sort of complaining, like, this isn't a sci-fi game, it's a fantasy game. Like, I don't want to worry about, like, alien body parts or something like that. And it was kind of like a teaching moment of, like, that's not what gender is, my friends, right? And sort of, you know, and it kind of, to me then, you know, because again, they weren't real world cultures, that's kind of, I guess, the touchstone that when you first said your question really sort of rang true for me, right? Was that idea of gender and how portraying gender. There are other games I've worked on that, you know, do it differently, I think, but especially if it's kind of a fictional gender, right? Like, what does that mean? How to, like, sort of help someone inhabit that? And you're right, we can talk about that in the empathy and gaming panel, I think, too. But just, yeah, that notion of, like, sort of working through, well, it doesn't matter about your body, right? Here's how gender works, and we still try to make it about, like, biopower. There's a little bit of, like, Foucaultian sort of influence there, and so, like left-handed folks were actually gendered as a separate gender in this particular society, right? And so we had a little blurb about power over bodies and you know, sex and gender systems and things like that. But I mean, it was really careful sort of presentations. You definitely have the folks at the conventions that kind of, you know, will take that freedom and run in ways, and you have to kind of point out, like, hey, like, that's not really what this is about, or exploring the space, you know, isn't about delighting in your stereotypes. And I think maybe if I don't have as specific examples of, like, really trying to represent a real world culture as the rest of the panelists do, I think maybe we can kind of just resonate with that, right? Then, like, how do you sort of check the players when they're not doing that, right? And I've definitely been in places where I felt so overwhelmed as a game master just to have no idea how to stop what's happening in front of me. You know, years as an educator, I was like, I've never seen anyone in my class ever do that. Like, I don't know how to stop this person, right? And particularly, yeah, it would have been around those different portrayals of gender, I think, and being open to, yeah, the rest of the people at the table, really trying to coach someone through that space, right? If they're trying to inhabit a new space, that is great. That's good that they're trying to generate something new by inhabiting some new space. How can we do that responsibly, I guess? I mean, I think everyone's answers have been great. And yeah, my touchstone was just that idea of gender, and a fictional gender, no less. You know, just coaching people through that or something, really trying to get them just to think of bodies and spaces differently, to think of gender differently, to think of power structures differently because of that.
All right, so I'm going to ask all the viewers and the guests of the panel, the attendees, as they're called, to get questions into us through the chat or through the Q&A section. We'll get to them in a couple seconds. We're going to ask our last questions of the panelists, then we'll get to your questions. If you don't have any, we'll just keep asking questions because we've got the time, and I've got a microphone, so I can do it. All right, so let's start with this. Banana. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And so what good intentions have you had while designing any game about culture, things like that? And how did you fail? Did you? Have you?
Let's take the example of Junction again, because that's, like, the most fresh thing in my mind, because I'm still going through the document. But going back to that, I think one of the things that we wanted to do was we wanted to have, like, a lot of pieces of art, right? So this thing is going to be very visual. It's going to have, like, a lot of stuff going on. And at the time when we were commissioning art, when we were getting, you know, artists putting their stuff together, we were also or at least I was also watching Warrior.
Okay, you can say that word once and then no more.
Okay, all right. So Warrior, it's a great show. It's set in the 1800s, and it's based on I think it was Bruce Lee's screenplay. And it's very good, but it's set in the late 1800s and not in the 1920s. And we totally overlooked that fact. And when the artists were doing the artwork, they all had the Q hairstyle, which had gone out of fashion during the 1920s or it hadn't gone entirely out of fashion, but become like, not as popular as it once was. And so we did have some people call us out, luckily, and we were just like, oh, right, we should totally fix this thing because this is not correct and it was a symbol of oppression and we should probably do something about it. So luckily we reeled in and we were able to fix that. But that was, we had a lot of good intentions, kind of fell flat.
Yeah, it did. Alan, what about you? Have you ever had something that was well intended just kind of fall flat because of some misstep?
So yes and no. I've had something that was made with good intentions that resounded wildly with one part of my community, and then a handful of people were very vocal about their dislike for it because they didn't think it should be visible. In particular, it was it's a little role-playing game experience that I made for my local Native community as part of this this experiment in trying to connect organizations with giving foundations. And so there is this process where people from the community actually had these little characters, and the characters represented types of people who appear in our community, and they're all kind of interrelated. And you couldn't, as a funder, there's this experience where you couldn't actually get to all the people unless you talk to all the people. Otherwise, there's going to be people that you completely missed. And it went along with this this big art kind of display of, it was kind of a historical gallery where you had to go through and look at all these moments of history within our community. And so overall, so like the collection, the gathering of these characters and learning their stories, the characters were called what the heck were, it was an Oyate. It was like it was a little nation, but it was those little, we call those meeple. It was we called it the meeple Oyate.
Oh, that makes sense. Yes.
Everyone within our who were participating from the community who were doing this thing, at first they didn't understand it, and then they started doing it. They're like, "Holy crap, this is awesome! I see myself in so many pieces of this," and they're just spilling over with joy for just how powerful the thing was. But then on social media, some people who were outside of the community found out about it, and they had no context for it, whatever. They had no understanding of who was doing what and who was saying what, and all they saw was someone putting the word Mipo next to the word Oyate, and they decided that it was a complete appropriation and misuse of Lakota language, and they just got really, really, really angry and insulting, and it kind of caught me flat-footed. And it was one of those things where they didn't bother to ask, right? They just made some assumptions, and then they carried those assumptions and told those assumptions to other people. And so there's a small wave of assumptions that there's this terrible thing happening. But luckily there are other people from the community who said, no, this is okay. And even then, they that group decided that it wasn't okay, and it actually caused schism.
Right.
And so some of that schism is still there. I wasn't the source of schism, but I added to an already existing schism.
Right. I see. Okay.
So that definitely made me want to kind of pull my arms and legs into my turtle shell and scamper off.
It's hard to scamper when your legs are in your shell, though, Alan.
Oh, I roll, like Gamera, a little flyer.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, you have like rocket legs like Gamera.
Yeah, there we go.
Very cool. Sorry, Banana, you had a point to add?
I just want to say real quick that sometimes, like, I feel like this happens a lot in like with marginalized creators or creators who like are trying to make something, and then like other people sort of say stuff. It's from a place of like hurt. Like we've experienced it sort of as well, where they're just trying to look at because there's so much stuff that's already built into, you know, pop culture where people are misrepresented already, like sometimes they get really defensive over things like that because they're like, oh, this is like another thing that's just going to be like this other thing that happened, and we're never going to have good representation. But if we don't have good representation and like if we don't keep making stuff, then we'll never get like, you know, good stuff out there. So
See Mulan. There you go.
yeah.
Banana has a big not like for Mulan. Mike, what do you think? Has there ever been any times when in your game creation you have had a great intention and then fell short of that? What do you think?
I mean, I'm not sure. I guess like this is my first game, and I still need to finish it and get it out. So I don't know. Maybe the future will tell.
Okay, so in a year, I'm going to ask you the same
Yeah.
question. Okay. But what about in your artwork? Because you do graphic design and things like that. Have you ever used?
Actually, like now that the examples that Aline and Banana mentioned, like I also did cultural consultation for the game Cartel.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
So, and yeah, there was like some people have that just pushback without even reading what the game is about, how the game plays, or just because like they see it's a game about Mexico and it's about narcos. They think it's like as Banana mentioned, like it's again the same thing, right? It's the same thing we've been seeing in media, just like stereotyping Mexicans as narcos, and that's bad. And yeah, like I mean, I've working on it. Like I can like assure people that's not the case, and that's one of the reasons I decided to work on it, because it puts like tells you like people are these people working in the cartels are also humans, and they are in that situation because very hard like stuff that is happening to them, and many times is like there is a lot of other problems around it, like, and yeah, like no matter how much good intentions we have about like having people try to see the other side, not just like they are the bad guys, and seeing them also like human, like putting their shoes and trying to humanize them, like for most good intentions that we may have. There's people that they just it's a big no for them, like, and also related to what Alan said about if they were close to a tragic situation or to a trauma with cartels or with like the narcos here in Mexico, they will also be like, no, that's so bad. And yeah, I guess like that's not the intention, and that's not like, and Mark the designer is very open to talking at length about it, but many people just don't want to talk. They just don't want, like, no, I want to know, I don't want to hear about it. This is bad. So yeah, I guess that that's my touchstone.
Yeah, I can get that. Calvin, what about you? Any missteps in your game design history where you've tried to have good intentions, but all went all the way down to HE double hockey sticks?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of mentioned one earlier, just with with some of the stuff, particularly again, what we did was more about fictional cultures, right? And just trying to sort of take elements, not like in a cut up and reimagine way, but more like specifically it was like didactic and like polemical, right? To specifically say like, hey, a lot of these Western games like D&D sort of imagine feudalism, even though it's more like capitalism sort of pushed, it's not even real feudalism. But so let's think of like other ways that societies and cultures have been arranged, right? What other power structures are there that aren't wealth, right? Like what that might look like. And so I kind of mentioned that in the South Asian context. And, I feel like in that intention of sort of representing a different way of being and a non-capitalist way of being, I do feel like there's probably a couple paragraphs, in that early dark book that I would have liked to have really then speak to that, these other systems better, they have their own sorts of negative things, and there are people within that system fighting against it too, right? And I really, would feel bad. I've never had anyone, sort of come up and mention that, but I would just feel so terrible if, in trying to show this other mode of being, that I somehow, reified it in a way, and didn't leave room for, it wasn't revolutionary. I didn't mention that particular rigid social system and leave room for revolution, I guess, right? We had it sort of in the game, and that does wake me up at night sometimes, right? Like, I hope everything else that's anti-essential in the game would never let someone slip into that, but I don't know. And then another one, I guess, again, just bringing up the things I've mentioned before, like about that gender, having that sort of fictional non-binary system, right? Like, here's a way a culture could imagine genders being non-binary. Definitely the way we presented that probably doesn't sort of talk well with contemporary trans politics. And that just kind of bums me out, right? Like, really, we were presenting it from like a strongly feminist perspective, and I think it was very progressive, like, theoretically, but now it's like the way we presented that, it's like, ooh, I could change just these 3 things, and then it would sort of make more sense in contemporary sort of political discourse. But 10 years, have gone since then, and it's like, the conversation has changed, discourse has changed. And so if it wasn't at the time sort of like a mishap, now it's like, darn it, that was a missed opportunity. Like, I didn't, envision what trans discourse would look like. And I kind of just bummed out, right, that the way we were trying to help educate about gender, the way we were, putting those things in, then, just kind of didn't then leave room for like, oh yeah, and then there's this other stuff that we could talk about too, even with things like gender fluidity and having a particular characters in the game that, are referenced with different pronouns and actually change gender at parts of the game. We made that more just to talk about gender fluidity and gender non-binary, not to actually have a trans character or something, right? And so like, it's just kind of like, sort of like a missed opportunity there that, from time and stuff like that, just didn't, a missed opportunity, I guess.
Right. Okay, well, lots of pitfalls, lots of traps to fall into, but I think a lot of great advice from the panel on how to avoid some of those as well. So we have some questions from the audience. I'm going to read them out here. We have, I don't know what happens if I hit answer live. I would like to answer this question live. That's all it says. It doesn't bring it up onto the screen or anything. Okay, this is from Jacob Parker Carver. Jacob asks, Alan brought up the idea of world building, especially in the context of fantasy, and the importance of acknowledging / respecting sources of inspiration. What are some other things to consider when crafting new worlds and cultures? I'll put that out to the general crowd. I mean, Alan, that was sort of based off of what you were doing. And I know, Calvin, that is what you're working in, is creating new worlds and cultures. So maybe you have some stuff that's important as well. And then obviously, Mike and Banana, if you want to jump in, go right ahead. Who wants to take that one? Go ahead, Alan.
I'll start. So I think there's a bunch of things, and some of them are small, some of them are huge. I think the first is paying attention to so even if you're writing new cultures and making new genders or doing any of this other stuff, things are always going to read somehow or another back to their inspirations, right? You look at something like Steven Universe, and all the gems read as something, even though they're not. They have a read, and so when you are creating from and taking inspiration from particular cultures, being very careful not to do this thing that happens where people will make Eurocentric cultures and allow them to be anything, but then they'll take other ethnicities and force them to parallel as much as possible historically accurate, or their variation of historically accurate, whatever. So if something, for instance, if cultures are, if you're taking inspiration from an Asian culture, somehow or another, that culture always winds up in the East on your continent, right? And then there's, like, if you're building magic systems, paying attention to whether you purposely or accidentally do this thing where the colonizer magic is the most powerful magic and everybody else's magic is interesting and quirky, but never as good. Right. This is like harkens back to old D&D days, where as long as you were more or less a traditional magic user, read, you're a wizard, then you got to get up to 9th level spells like Wish and whatnot. But everybody else, their stuff stopped at 6th and 7th level, right? They were never allowed to be quite as powerful. Avoiding the thing where you're doing reads and you want to work with, and I see there's a question that relates to this, that you have an oppressed people. Don't make all your oppressed people read as real life oppressed people, right? Because then you're on the edge of racism, because now your monsters are representations of the monsters that people saw these other people as. And then my last one is language. Words have meaning. Be mindful of the words you use, and if you're representing any kind of indigenous people, for God's sake, please do not call them shamans. Don't call their holy people shamans. Like, we don't have shamans amongst the Lakota people, and people are always calling us shamans. We actually have names for our stuff, just like there are rabbis and cardinals and vicars and whatnot. And you don't those things aren't freely substitutable. Neither are our names, and our names have meaning. So take the time to find out what those things are. If you can't, then don't do it. Right? Don't just kind of fall back into these buckets that are accessible to the macro culture. But because when you do that, that is still a violent bit of colonization that works to erase the microculture.
Like, you put us in your bucket.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Excellent answer. Does anybody else want to field this question? Calvin?
I guess.
Oh,
Yeah.
Mike, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, like, also go beyond just the looks. Like, also, like, think or he like, the question is talking about, like, crafting new worlds, right, and cultures, like, but you don't those not just like, yeah, they all look different, but they all live the same. Like, each culture needs to have, like, a different way that they live their lives, like the food they eat, the I mean, like, go deeper than just, like, yeah, they all look different, but they are all just basically the same in their structures, in their power structures, as Calvin mentions, and all those things that, yeah, don't make just everything like European, like, or I guess the word is Eurocentric in the way the culture is structured. Like, give different to those cultures, like, so they can feel more alive and not just like a look in a book with an illustration.
Great. Calvin, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think one of those sort of like easy pitfalls is like the idea of the analog, right? And we can see that kind of like what Alan mentioned, like, are they always in the East? Or like, even whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, like having analogs, that's stereotype territory, right? And so, even you can look back at like Robert E. Howard and Conan, and like, or Tolkien with like, the maps kind of overlap the maps, right? And so avoiding analogs, I think, is probably, if you're truly having inspiration, the culture that you're making is then unique and different. If you're just sort of making the analog or glossing over or borrowing because you think, one or two elements are pretty or something, that's not creating something new with an inspiration. So this maybe goes back even to Banana sort of thing, like, what's your intention? Do this deliberately, do this consciously. And if you're just trying to make an analog, that's probably one of those early red flags that something's up, that maybe you're not, like, if it's truly new, make it truly new. Don't just be analog.
Great. Alan, yes.
So that reminds me, and this speaks to both what Calvin was just saying and what Banana said earlier. Ask yourself, whose fantasy is this? Right? Who are you centering in that fantasy? Are you adding these people just to exotify these other folks? Are they there to be saved by these other people? Are they there to be demonized by these other people? Or are you actually truly creating a culture that is the way it is because of nuanced forces and issues that have happened that they've responded to, and they've made rules and policies and language and whatnot to adjust for that? If you're doing that, that's awesome and that's interesting, and that means you could actually have a culture that I can forget everything else in your world, just go down the rabbit hole of that culture and have a ball. But if they only exist in that trope space, if they're only on the edge of dancing on the edge of stereotype, if they're basically Vulcans and Klingons, and there's not really a whole lot there beyond a few cool words and phrases being shouted and whatnot, then you're kind of dancing in a very dangerous space.
Mm-hmm. Banana, do you have anything to add to that?
I think everyone brought up some really good points. And I guess like sort of like touching on like the whole fantasy thing that that Alan was talking about as well. Like I think what I was thinking about was cyberpunk and how it is sort of this new thing, but at the same time, like all the protagonists are white. Like that's that's the thing, right? And it's like this futuristic world where everything is sort of like gritty, but it all comes from something, right? Like the backgrounds, the backdrops, like the neon signs, they're all like vaguely in some sort of mishmash of Asian language, but you never see any Asians in in cyberpunk settings. Or like when you dive deeper into like the worlds, it's like about how weird capitalism is, but then it somehow always ends up being like actually capitalism's okay. So I guess like thinking about that and trying to come up with something new is going to be quote unquote new is going to be difficult, but it's going to be a lot easier if you start from something that you already know. So like if you want to make a game about like a fantasy setting, and you live in the suburbs or something, like maybe starting from where you live and where you are, what you see day to day, instead of just like trying to look beyond the scope of your knowledge.
Okay, cool. Let's ask the next question. It is from an anonymous attendee who says, I am working on a new fantasy campaign where I plan to have orcs as an oppressed people. They have lost their culture and are basically treated as third-class people. I want to be sensitive towards the very real oppressed people in our own world. What advice do you have? Does anybody want to field that one? That's a big ball of wax. Who's going to take that? I'm just going to throw it at somebody if you don't take it. And their name is Banana. No,
Really?
Alan. No, Alan, go ahead. Alan, go ahead.
No, ladies first.
No, please, Alan. Go ahead.
So, lost their culture and basically treated as third-class people. So I think part of that is figuring out what was their culture in the first place, right? So when we say they've lost their culture, that typically means that people have suffered some level of assimilation. There's been some experience of genocide in their either cultural or actual physical genocide. Understand that story, right? Don't do the thing where people want to say these are my oppressed people and pick an oppressed people and make them an analog of those oppressed people. Don't do that. Figure out what the culture is of your orcs. What did they do? What happened to cause this them to be switched into this space? So I think a great example of this is there's this surprisingly awesome, at least to me, Korean fantasy show called the Arthdal Chronicles. Has anyone seen this? And it's a humanocentric world, and they have a tribe of people who wind up becoming enslaved by this other group. And while there are definitely bits and pieces of like old traditional Korean analogs of like their tribal peoples and other people's tribal peoples, it's neat because all of the various tribes kind of have their own thing going on. They've got their own perception of magic, they've got their own kinships, they've got all this stuff, and it's a struggle to kind of keep a lot of that stuff alive that you're watching, and people trying to kind of rebuild themselves as family and all this and whatnot. And so they don't wind up feeling like an obvious anything. And it's funny because I hadn't even watched it for the longest time, because when it showed up in Netflix, I thought it was going to be a terrible native stereotype thing, because there was because the image they used was just some guy with some face paint. But then when I ran out of things to watch, and I actually watched it. I was like,
that is
wow,
COVID time.
Yes,
fortunate COVID experience.
It was COVID binge. I was like, wow, they're really doing this interesting job of building this world, and they do it they make a dangerous world, they make an interesting world, they make interesting cultures, and they make an interesting problem. So I think if you're going to do this with your orcs, create an interesting problem and focus on the interesting problem and less on making them read as some other cultural group, and you'll wind up with a culture that manifests from that problem.
Mm-hmm. It's like Mouse, the graphic novel. I mean, it's written that way because it is an allegory. Unless your story is an allegory, try making something totally new. Does anybody else want to field this question? Calvin, Mike, Barb? Go ahead, Calvin.
And I think that's a great example too. I just watched only a few episodes of it, but the different groups really had full-on different like ontologies, right? And the idea of kinship and the relationship was great, right? And so, and I think this goes back to something Mike said too. If you're making something new, like, yeah, I mean, it has to actually be new, and they are not then. It's not even just the analog issue, but they should feel different in a way, right? Like they would have different values, different ways of doing things, different ways of eating, different ways of dressing, right? Like if you want to show that difference, it's not just in maybe like a hairstyle. It's not just by relying on analog. Like maybe in this culture, the hairstyle doesn't matter, right? Hairstyle matters to us or to, you know, to whoever. Like what's entirely different about their way, where it's not like we wear blue, we wear green, but like maybe we care about color, we don't care about color, right? The whole ontology is different. And if you can find little ways to show that, like I think that show does, just so different from each other, that would be really exciting, I think, and more so than the you know, the things we've all seen before.
Right, and that is available on Netflix. I put a link up to the Wikipedia page because that's what came up first. So there you go. Do not cite that as a primary source. As Professor Sen tells you not to. It is not a primary source. Mike and Banana, do you guys want to answer the question? Go ahead, Banana.
So I'm going to place a link into the chat that is an article from James Mendez Hodes about orcs in general, which might be like a good read.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so, and you've probably already read it, but it's called Orcs, Britons, and the Martial Race Myth, which basically talks about like, you know, orcs and the history of orcs in general. And so that like, you know, you sort of have an idea of how you can work around this if you want to pursue this idea.
All right, everybody. Well, that's it. We're going to wrap up the panel. Thank you very much, Banana. Mike, I'm so sorry we didn't get to you. Jack is telling me that we have to wrap up.
Okay, just last quick thing.
Yeah, quick,
maybe also hire Mendes.
Yeah. He is wonderful. He's a great person to work with. So very happy to see you all. Quickly, Calvin, tell us where we can find you on the internet.
I am at Anthropos Games, so you can go to Anthropos Games at Twitter or .com or any of your favorite places. Mostly, I only do stuff on Twitter, so please, yeah, feel free to check us out and say howdy.
There you go, Mike. Let us know where you're at.
I'm at Twitter at Chantolo RPG with XX Antolo RPG, and also SmokingMirrorGames.com. SmokingMirrorGames.com.
Great, Banana. Where are you at?
You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Banana Chan Games, and you can find my company, Game in a Curry, at Game in a Curry on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Mr. Alan Turner.
You can find me at my website blog, which is councilofools.com/blog. You can also find me on Twitter at Council of Fools, and I'm on Instagram as Kaji Sapa, but it's mostly nature pictures. So unless you want to look at pictures of bugs and beetles and flowers, you probably don't want to go there.
All right, and on that note, I'm Senfeng Lim. You can find me on Twitter at Senfeng Lim, and we'll see you back here for other panels at Save Against Fear 2020. See you later. Bye.